Hello, thanks for joining me. I'd like to start by reading you a poem by Rudyard Kipling. It's called We and They. All good people agree, and all good people say, all nice people like us are we, and everyone else is they. But if you cross over the sea instead of over the way, you may end up by, think of it, looking on we as only a sort of they. What is Kipling telling us in this poem? Well, to start off with, he talks about separate groups, we and they. We is us, all nice people, in other words, our culture, and they is everybody else, other cultures. What distinguishes these two groups from each other? The answer is not so much that they are separated by distance, but that they are separated by differences. Kipling also suggests that we need to make an effort to understand other cultures, and I think he uses the line, but if you cross over the sea instead of over the way, in a metaphorical sense rather than a literal sense. To me, the words go over the sea suggest that a greater effort needs to be made and we must delve deeper in order to understand others, rather than taking a superficial over-the-way approach. Delving deeper involves seeking to gain a greater understanding of not only others, but also ourselves. In fact, in order for us to understand cultural differences, we need to understand or start with understanding ourselves, we, and only then can we begin to understand others, they. We cannot understand and adapt to other cultures unless we have attained a degree of cultural self-awareness. Self-awareness is the key to cultural understanding. That's what I'd like to talk about today. However, before we do, we need to understand the concept of different cultures, and in order to do this, it's useful to explore the evolution of social structures and how and why we have ended up in a world made up of so many different cultural groups, a world consisting of we and they. Well, as far back as humans have inhabited this planet, we have been social beings, and for survival, practical and emotional reasons, we've congregated with others and have been members of groups. As we've evolved, groups have become parts of communities, which became parts of societies which developed into countries. Our world is therefore the combination of a number of groups and subgroups. As we've progressed, our social structures have developed in order to accommodate our needs, and their effectiveness is dependent on conformity. By conforming to the attitudes, behaviours and standards of the majority of these group members, we also contribute to the maintenance of them. And as behaviours are a result of the way we think and feel, group membership has influenced our thinking, values, attitudes, assumptions, and even our emotions. Therefore, who we are as individuals is very much determined by which groups we belong to. These thought processes, behaviours, and artefacts that are shared by the members of a society are what is referred to as culture. Historical, economic, environmental, genetic and numerous other influences contribute to significant differences from group to group, and we therefore find ourselves living in a world consisting of many different cultures. These differences not only consist of the superficial observable ones that can be easily identified, but also those that are underlying, that are much less obvious, but much more influential as they determine how a person views the world they live in. So culture is not something we're born with, instead it's acquired and developed due to our exposure to it. The people that share the environment we live in determine how we view and respond to the world around us. We learn through the influence of others what is right or wrong, good or bad, what we should or should not do, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. As an example, let me ask you a question. Do you eat meat? If so, what type of meat? The type of meat really means which animal it comes from. We eat animals. Have you ever asked yourself why we eat certain animals and not others? Have you ever asked yourself why we eat lambs and not dogs, cows and not horses, rabbits and not cats, pigs and not donkeys? Why is it okay to eat some animals and not others? Because that's what we've learnt from the people around us. That's what our culture has taught us. People from other cultures won't eat cows, others won't eat pigs, because of the influence of their cultures. Hofstadter and Bond, two renowned culture researchers, define culture as the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the members of one category of people from those of another. Cultural self-awareness is all about understanding this programming of the mind and these influences, how they have shaped us, and therefore why we are who we are. It gives us an insight into ourselves, which in turn helps us to understand others. Why is this important? Because everybody's lives will be better in so many ways if we understand ourselves and others, and we and they are connected. So, given the fact that understanding ourselves is the first and arguably the most important factor when understanding people from other cultural groups, let me ask you something. How well do you think you know yourself? Now, you probably think that you know yourself pretty well. Most of us think that we do. You know your physical characteristics, your height, the colour of your eyes, your shoe size, your cholesterol level. Some of us are even very much aware, and maybe too much aware, of things like our age and maybe even our weight. We're also likely to be aware, at least to some extent, of our behaviours, our habits, how we react and behave in certain circumstances, our preferences, likes and dislikes, our attitudes towards certain things, and so on. Despite all of this, I'm going to suggest that most of us don't know ourselves very well at all. In fact, I think that most of us are strangers to ourselves. What we've just spoken about are really the more observable characteristics of ourselves and the people around us. Those things that can be more easily seen, heard, felt, etc. I like to refer to these as the what. So putting the physical characteristics aside, let me ask you this. Do you know why? Do you know the reasons for those more easily identifiable traits? Do you know why you think the way that you do? Why some things are more important to you than others? Why you notice some things and not others? In your mind, what determines what is right or wrong, good or bad, polite or rude, acceptable or not acceptable? In other words, do you know why you believe what you believe? I think this is a very fascinating question, but it wasn't until relatively recently that I even thought of asking it. Let me tell you how I got to this point. I spent most of my working life in international business roles, conducting business with people all around the world. So I have a lot of experience interacting with people from different cultures. I observed many differences that extended far beyond just the language, but I didn't ask why. Why? Because I already knew. At least I thought I did. I worked it out all by myself, without going to too much trouble at all. I interpreted the behaviours of others based on what I knew about what those behaviours meant, and an assumption that the meaning that I attributed to those different behaviours are universal. I have to admit, I was wrong. For example, in a face-to-face conversation, when the other person avoided eye contact with me, it meant that they were lying. There was no question in my mind that that was the reason. I knew that from experience. But that experience was limited to what I had learnt from the environment that I was exposed to and the one that I knew, from the people who I shared that environment with. In other words, my culture. I assumed that the meaning of that behaviour was universal. It never occurred to me that another person from a different culture might attribute a different meaning to that same behaviour. So in this case, I made several mistakes. Mistake number one, I viewed the behaviour from my perspective rather than theirs. Mistake number two, I assumed that the meaning of that behaviour was the same for them as it was for me. And mistake number three, I attributed an intent and judged that person based on my interpretation of that behaviour. Now, to try and make myself feel better, I'm going to say that I'm not the only person that has made these mistakes. And I'm also going to suggest, which will make me feel even better still, that most of us make these mistakes constantly. So what was the real reason for the person not looking me in the eye when they spoke to me? I found out later that their intention was to show humility and respect. They wanted to show me that they acknowledged and respected the differences in status that they perceived existed between the two of us. In their minds, they were complimenting me by raising my status above theirs and then showing me the level of respect deserving of that position. I thought they were lying, were being disrespectful. I judged them as being untrustworthy, virtually the opposite to their intention. How wrong can you be? The question is, do we know that we do this? Do we know ourselves well enough to identify that we think and react this way? I didn't. Self-awareness is the key to cultural understanding. After a while, I learnt that my interpretation of what I observe is really based on underlying assumptions that exposure to my culture has taught me. In other words, the things I take for granted that I don't even think of questioning. These assumptions determine how I see the world and how I think it should be. How I react is based on my interpretation, which is based on my values that are based on my assumptions. Therefore, if those assumptions are wrong, so is my interpretation and my reaction. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. Mark Twain sums it up nicely in this quote. The trouble with the world is not that people know too little, but they know too much that ain't so. Let's explore this further by looking at the commonly used metaphor, the iceberg. For our purposes though, let's look at the iceberg as not having just two parts, above and below the surface, but four. One above and three levels or layers below the surface. The smallest section of the iceberg is the visible one that's above the surface. This represents our behaviours and artefacts, the things we surround ourselves with. This top part is what is easily observable by ourselves and others. In other words, it's the means by which we communicate. This smallest part of the iceberg provides us with clues, but alone it doesn't provide us with true meaning. In my earlier example, the behaviour not looking me in the eye is an example of the top of the iceberg. What's above the surface is built on the larger part of the iceberg that is below the surface, the section we don't see. I refer to this as the why, because it determines what's visible above. In other words, what we do, how we communicate, the things we surround ourselves with are the direct result of what's below the surface that we don't see and are often not consciously aware of. The three sections or layers of the iceberg below the surface are at different depths. Each of these layers are built on each other and are therefore influenced by the layer beneath. The layer directly beneath the surface represents our attitudes, thoughts and feelings, which determine our behaviours. This layer is just below the surface, and although not as obvious as what is above, it's a bit easier to see than those further down. To understand it fully though, we need to dive down to explore it. Our attitudes, thoughts and feelings are determined by the section or layer of the iceberg beneath this one. This layer represents our values, that is, those things that are important to us, what we believe is right or wrong, good or bad. The values layer is further below the surface and we will need to dive deeper in order for us to understand it. The values layer sits on top of the very bottom section of the iceberg, which is the assumptions layer. Those things that we just take for granted, that we don't even question, and to us it's just the way that the world is. This is the hardest part of the iceberg to explore, because it's very far below the surface and we need to dive very deep to understand it. We should see the iceberg though as representing people and not the concept of culture. In our metaphor, culture could be represented by the ocean the iceberg has grown and developed in. The different characteristics of the different oceans, such as the currents, depth, salinity, temperature, organisms and so on, would result in the development of different icebergs. Those icebergs in the same ocean would have similar characteristics and would be quite different to the icebergs in other oceans. Maybe the line in Kipling's poem, "But if you cross over the sea," should be changed to, "But if you go beneath the sea." Unfortunately, subconsciously we tend to use what's below our surface to try to understand what's above somebody else's. This is obviously a flawed approach for a number of reasons. Firstly, when the two parties are from different cultural backgrounds, different oceans, the differences between the submerged parts of the iceberg are likely to be much greater. Secondly, not only are we often not aware that we do this, but in many instances we don't even know what the basis of our interpretation is. In other words, we don't know what's below our iceberg. In order to demonstrate the iceberg concept, let's have a look at another example that shows how this works in practical terms. This is another personal example, but one much closer to home. I grew up in Australia after moving here at a very young age with my parents from Sicily in Italy. We came from a very poor rural background where hard physical labour was the only means my parents had of making a living, and it only just managed to provide them with the basic necessities of life. Their families were too poor to provide them with a good education, and after completing primary school they were required to work to help support their families. Their environment was made up of two types of people, the haves and the have-nots. The have-nots were the inferior, second-class, uneducated citizens that were looked down upon, ridiculed and even taken advantage of by the haves. All through my childhood, my parents constantly spoke about the importance of being successful and were always telling me to study. Birthday and Christmas presents usually consisted of books and fountain pens. And I remember one year they had a desk made for me, as well as a large frame print of the world. Toys or games were not even considered as presents, as they were seen as having no value and a waste of time and money. Playing was not something I should be spending my time on, and was discouraged. Success to them meant a career as a professional, such as a doctor or lawyer, and therefore the conversations they had with me, as well as their friends, often centred on the importance of studying and learning. Probably the most telling behaviour they exhibited that demonstrates this was the fact that they left their family and friends in Sicily and moved to a strange land where they didn't know anyone and without any money or knowledge of the language, in order to give me a better chance of succeeding. These behaviours, conversations and symbols represented the top of their iceberg, that part above the surface. Why did they display these behaviours? Because of their beliefs and attitudes, thoughts and feelings relating to the importance of study, hard work and education, and that these would contribute to a better, more successful and happier life. These are part of the layer of the iceberg that sits just below the surface. These attitudes and beliefs were based on my parents' values, the next layer in the iceberg. They placed a great deal of importance on gaining the respect from others, financial security, a professional career, and a higher status in the community. This was a feature of their culture that they were exposed to and they learned from. All of these stem from the assumptions that my parents and their culture had relating to the world they live in. In this case, they took for granted that the world is made up of people of different status and importance levels, which is directly aligned to their levels of education, their careers, and the amount of money they have. The respect a person receives is dependent on their status level, and therefore people of a higher status are superior and better people than those of a lower status. For them, these are the facts of life and something that was just not questioned. Let me ask you this. How do you think our Australian next door neighbours would have interpreted and judged the behaviours of my parents? You might say things such as, my parents were being too strict, over the top, bringing me up the wrong way, selfish, depriving me of my childhood, pushing me too hard, being uncaring and insensitive, bad parenting, and so on. Conversely, how do you think my parents would have interpreted the behaviours of our Australian neighbours, who brought up their children quite differently? Your answers here might include too lenient, bringing up their children the wrong way, bad parenting, not taking an interest in their children's future, teaching their children the wrong values, setting their children up for a life of failure, not caring, and so on. It's very likely that neither my parents or our Australian neighbours were aware that they were interpreting and judging the other party's behaviours, the top of the iceberg, by what their own attitudes, values and assumptions were, what was below their own iceberg. It's also likely that they were not even consciously aware of the exact nature of what was below their own iceberg, and they didn't know why they were arriving at those interpretations and judgments. I also wonder how conscious they were that what was below the other party's iceberg was quite different to theirs. This demonstrates how our cultural background influences how we understand others and gives us meaning to what we observe in others. It also demonstrates how this leads to misunderstanding, and therefore the message received is often not the same as the message intended. To overcome this, we need to be aware of why we interpret they the way that we do. We need to be aware of what our own attitudes, values and assumptions are. We need to be aware that we use these as the basis of our interpretation and often judgment of others. And we need to be aware that our entire icebergs are different and not just that small portion above the surface. Therefore, in order to understand other cultures, we need to understand ourselves first. Edward Hall, the renowned cultural researcher and scholar, sums it up in his quote, "Years of study have convinced me that the real job is not to understand foreign culture, but to understand our own. Self-awareness is the key to cultural understanding."